Alright everyone, fascism has come to America, wrapped in a flag and waving a cross. Oh wait, wrong flag and wrong symbology. It's actually managed to come in this particular generation in a completely different guise. What's happened is this. The nature of authoritarianism never actually changes. It just has different branding behind it. So the authoritarianism we had, let's say after 9/11, for about a decade and a half, it was hyper-patriotism, which was misused by the powers that be, and this is the nature of centralized systems, which are always leftist, by the way, always include heavy state control. If you think that Bush was a conservative, then I've got some land in Florida to sell you, and it's awfully swampy, lots of it. Back then, it was we need to pray more to Jesus to save us from terrorists. We need more flags. We need more made in America stuff. To the exclusion of free trade, in some cases you'll notice, although that was forsaken very quickly for economic reasons. You remember Mission Accomplished, things like that. That was the fascism of the day. You had corporations and government meshing together. Early wave tech, by the way, wasn't really part of this. At the time, back then, up until really the middle of the 2010s, tech was kind of libertarian. It was the people's platform. Like what I'm doing now was smiled upon by even the rich tech billionaires. Then they realized how wonderful it was to buy members of Congress to make even more money, and they got corrupted by it. These days, the fascism we see, and it's worse, I would say, this time than it was last, the current cultural and socio-political struggle really is wokeness. It's id pol of a different kind. Before, it was id pol, and it was sort of a post-Cold War us versus them, the Western Hemisphere or civilization or whatever versus those people over there that are trying to blow you up. That was how it was branded. As a result of that, we got body scanners at the airport. We got surveillance on the internet, or at least attempts at it, to the point where they were trying to go through people's library records. You got crackdowns on anything that was considered outside of the orthodoxy of Western culture. You'll remember, if you were a high schooler in the 2000s, you probably remember the torture game, for example. The rise of rap music in popular consciousness. Things like that became the boogeymen of that era. The era before that was marked by the satanic panic, worries about punk rock and the gothic movement and style, heavy metal, things like that. And before that, if you go back another generation, worries about drug use, again, leading to more authoritarianism, the war on drugs, which had already begun with, the war against opium a century ago, and then opium became more fashionable with oxycodone and stuff, and the government made a lot of money off that, which is why you still haven't had closure. And then marijuana became the big boogeyman. Marijuana and shrooms and all of the good, honk honk, the good drugs. You didn't hear that from me. Now, though, it's wrapped in a pride flag, and it's ranting about protecting the children, and that is still being used the same exact way as it was before. Before, it was if you don't align with the U.S. government's stated policies and with the orthodoxy of U.S. culture, and I'm talking mainly about the U.S. and its sphere here, then you hated the children, you wanted grandma to die, you want airplanes to fly into skyscrapers, and you're a pinko and stuff. Now it's you're a racist, you're sexist and homophobic simply because you disagree with the current cultural paradigm largely being pushed by corporations for corporate gain. So you see with wokeness, like with Pride Month, all the corporations change their avatars to a rainbow flag. Not a single one of these corporations actually did anything meaningful to help people who are LGBT anywhere else in the world. Not a single one of them changed their avatar for their Twitter page or anything as it appears in Arabic or something like that, or in Eastern Europe. Only for the polite society of Western civilization. That's the only group that they catered to by this. The second that Pride Month ended, they all went back to their normal logos. The same happened with BLM. You saw like Nike and Microsoft and Google and all these others flying the BLM flag. As soon as in public consciousness that waned, once the 15 minutes of fame of those race riots had ended, they all went back to normal. It's amazing. It's almost like they were catering to people who at the time had an elevated current public consciousness in order to sell more products by trying to outwoke one another. The problem is that this is openly promoted now by the U.S. government and other governments as well. They openly grift off this as well in order to create a sort of faux patriotism. See, they've left behind the civic nationalistic policies of a few decades ago, and they've pivoted because of a movement in public consciousness. And the people, by and large, this is why I don't support direct democracy. The people's will is really what shaped this. The fact that they can take the pulse of the public, create a few polls, and find out the sort of things the public more or less aligns with, allows them to create a simple majority sort of mentality, try to create an echo chamber whenever possible, and brand things to them. This is fascism. This is effectively what fascism is. People have the wrong idea when they think that fascism comes from some scary dictator, invariably with bizarre facial hair or an odd haircut, like Hitler, Mussolini, who was a billiard ball, or think of Kim Jong-un or something. They think it comes from the top down, but it never does. The people demand it. The people uprise, the people create a consciousness. It's often subversive in nature. Some communist group or some other subversive element has undermined the former civic fabric and injected into the public that opinion, and then it takes hold. What happens, and I mentioned this years ago, is that usually what happens is the old center, the old mainstream parties that exist no longer at some point are capable of governing the situation. I always default to Weimar Germany. People don't realize that what happened there really was that several relatively small movements at first in Germany began to feed off of one another. It was a never-ending spiral. So you had the National Socialists and you have the Communists. At first these were nothing parties. Nobody cared about them. They were in the single digits. What happened, though, is that the communists would say, look at those thug Nazis over there. They're going to kill you. They're going to destroy culture. They're going to enslave you all. So they would go to people who were on the margins of the far left. They themselves were not fanatics, but they leaned in that direction away from National Socialism and say, look, the center's not guarding you. They're not doing anything about this problem. You have to join us. And then you had economic problems, and of course they had the external backing to give people the blanket, to give people the cudgel and the hat, and then the basic uniform, and go out and crush some Nazis. Then the National Socialists said, look, there's more communists than ever. The center's not doing anything about it. So they would go to the mainline conservatives and give them the same basic spiel and say, look, they can't govern. They're ineffective. You're starving. There's like 25-30% unemployment in some parts of Germany at the time, and it got worse than that at times as well. Got high inflation and all of these problems that we currently see in many Western nations today. You have to join with us, because if you don't, then the alternative is worse. You'll be commies. You'll be in a gulag. And so both of these sides slowly got more and more powerful. The center tried to congeal in order to fight them off, but it was never capable of doing so because it had an old guard mentality. It was a dinosaur in the age of flight. This is the same as we see in some parts of the Western world today. When we look at the rhinos of the Republican Party, I'll use the U.S. as the main example because I'm an American, or the mainline Democrats, they're both being embattled by outside forces. When I look at the populist, like the MAGA movement, that's not extreme. It's basically just a throwback to the 80s and the 90s, actual conservatism of maybe first-term Reagan or something like that. Back when there was more common sense, less idpol actually in politics beyond the religious issue, which is really declining as a U.S. value anyway. Whether you are religious or not, certainly you have to admit that has been happening. In the absence of that particular coalescing factor, the right has moved more to populism. The left is embracing socialism. These are further apart as ideologies than the neolib and neocon ideologies of the last few decades. The reason that this is happening is because people who are on the center right or center left are looking at the other side specifically, again, from increasing and often tech-based echo chambers, and saying they're getting more fanatic. And so they move in the other direction without self-realizing they're becoming more out there as well, at least again judged against that mainstream background. The problem is that right now in this particular paradigm, the more authoritarian sphere that has emerged is not the populists. That's basically just a reaction to the elevation of far leftism in the U.S. Democratic Party. Both parties are moving further away from one another. For instance, if you look at the first wave of people wearing MAGA hats, this is years ago, if you look at 2015 or 16, Look at some of the people and some of the rhetoric that you saw at the time. Isn't it night and day from what you see from like Marjorie Taylor Greene? Now, I'm not saying that that makes her a bad person or an extremist or anything like that, and I don't believe in political censorship, but it's different. It's moving in that direction. I said that the best possible thing that could happen is that the left would collapse and the Democrats would be forced to reform and restore decorum. That didn't happen. It might happen in the midterms. Maybe they finally autopsy their party if they get crushed enough, and I hope that this happens. I think that the only thing at this point that solves the problem is for the U.S. left wing to be jettisoned from the Democratic Party and them to restore a pre-neoliberal function. That is, there would be leftism in it on some issues, but by and large they'd go back to like a party of JFK sort of feel. They would readopt civic awareness, because that civic awareness can glue together a culture that has always had that kind of civic awareness in the wake of the Civil War. Right now, the real fascism, the real authoritarianism, is corporate branded. And it's no longer, hey, we're made in the USA, you should buy our product. No, it's we're globalistic, we oppose all forms of populism, and Orange Man bad, of course. The problem is that this is a fairly toxic ideology. What you see actually outgrowing from the left at the moment, in the United States at least, it deviates wildly from like left-wing movements even in most countries. In many countries it's still like Union Party mentality. So for instance, especially here in Europe, the left-wing movements that exist here, minus like the green movements and stuff, climate change, we need more taxes and so forth, is not the same as the sort of id poll that you see from someone like Cori Bush or Ayanna Pressley or Ilhan Omar or AOC. Those sort of individuals ultimately at the end of the day are hyper-partisan subversives who in some cases have literally been put in there as part of an effort by the moneyed classes that pretend to be leftist but really are neoliberals as a facade to try to fool young people specifically. This is causing those individuals to become more fanatic because they've been promised, for example, in this last election, they were promised universal pre-K, affordable health care for everyone, and universal Medicaid. They've been promised more stimulus and UBI and all these things. They're not going to get them. The votes don't exist. This is going to erode the center, despite the fact that it's the failure of the far left to deliver on promises by basic structure, and because they're insane and really not even in line with more enlightened forms of leftism insofar as they can exist, and they really have more in common with Maduro in Venezuela or even the model of North Korea. They will successfully, I believe, blame the neoliberals. It's only a matter of time before this comes to a head. This can take two forms. Either they continue getting more fanatic and numerous, in which case the right wing eventually abandons MAGA populism and goes further right. This can be extremely problematic and will lead to a protracted cultural war. It will cause crime to rise, there will be terrorism and all of these terrible attendant things. Or the left successfully is crushed out, reverts to being basically a sub-minor party presence in the United States. And people realize that really that is part of the problem, as well as elements of the furthest right. But the thing is, those elements have been largely purged from the MAGA thing. If you look online, and those of you in the BitChute comment section, by and large, are certainly further into the traditionalism, nationalism thing than the mainline populists would be, or certainly that my more libertarian mentality would be. The thing is that a lot of these people, and most of them will self-proclaim this, angry at Trump, don't like it anymore. You see like Anomaly going into Trump derangement syndrome mode, and adopting even further out their beliefs. Part of this is the problem of tech censorship, and again, that fits right in with the fascism of our era. These corporations have branded themselves woke and nice, and think of the children and all of these other things. It's the same thing that we've gone through before over and over and over again. It's like a cycle. Every 20, 30 years. Every generation or so, this happens. That's the other part of it. The unfortunate part is that it's a never-ending sort of struggle because it's an intergenerational one. As Gen Z rises up, they've adopted some of those fanatic ideologies, although a lot of them have gone in the other direction, which is to their credit. They're better already than the millennials. I hate to be part of this generation. I'd rather be like 15 years older or younger at the moment, but that's not going to happen. What's happened is that they're absorbing that ideology, mostly from the Gen X parent sort of thing. So their parents, in some cases, they were like slackers. That might turn them conservative. They might start, smoking Chesterfields and looking like Ronald Reagan. Or they've absorbed sort of that hippie-ish mentality, gimme, gimme, The government needs to do more for me. And on the right, you see the reaction to that, and really it is technically a reaction that starts with the Tea Party, technically with the Ron Paul revolution. Generally speaking, of course, he was robbed of the nomination. I think he would have been a much better president than second-term Obama, but I'm slightly biased because I voted for the dude. And now you've got fascism in the United States, but it's in a different form, and people unfortunately are less able to realize that because they associate that with right-wing ideologies. They don't realize it's the same thing. It's still authoritarianism. Think of authoritarianism is the whole. Communism's part of that. It overlaps, but it's not all authoritarianism. Fascism is part of that, although fascism kind of seeps into it all because of the state control aspect and the inevitability of industrial production, kind of an inescapable term, semi-overlapped with all of authoritarianism. You could have a theocracy. It'd be an authoritarian system, but it's not necessarily a communistic one. I should probably draw up a diagram of this because people don't seem to understand all of these terms and how they have an interplay with one another. So unfortunately, the lemmings right now are cheering. They're literally liberal individuals. People that are not fanatic. People that are like, well, I think that corporations should pay a little bit more and then we should let everything else alone. Yes, I support a little bit of a welfare increase. As long as it doesn't raise my taxes, tax that other guy. These normal, like garden variety NIMBY liberals are right now, at least in the open, as a facade. Some of them don't believe in it personally behind closed doors. Trust me, I've interacted with them. They engage in this id poll sort of situation partially out of a worry of being cut out of the system entirely. When you can be cut out of the banking system and out of engaging in basic commerce or communication and be silenced fundamentally by a bunch of billionaires, what are we supposed to call that other than fascism, regardless of the grounds upon which they justify such action? That's what I would ask people. That's about all. Peace out.